Okay, and then I'd like to just get started today by thanking everyone that we have in attendance for our event today and being able to make it. And then also I'd like to thank our speaker that we have today, Dr. Kyle Householder, who's been very gracious to be our guest speaker for this month's event. And then the topic that we're going to be discussing is on how to break into your first MSL role and progress your MSL career. So I'm sure this is going to be highly relevant to many of our attendees, as many of them are looking to break into the MSL role, or some may already be MSLs and looking to progress their career. So just to get started, just going to ask Kyle to tell us a little bit about his background and his experience in medical affairs, and so from going from academia and that transition into medical affairs.
Sure. So a little bit of background about myself. I completed my Ph.D. at Arizona State University in research at Barrow Neurological, focused mostly around drug delivery to the brain in the context of brain tumors, but a lot of side projects. One that love to get involved with anything and everything, which will be a theme throughout this entire presentation or this entire discussion, even as kind of moving along through your career of raising your hand and taking advantage of opportunities. But some of those opportunities involved TBI, ALS, and really just kind of thinking about how we deliver to the brain in general. And then my reason for going on to my PhD originally was, falling in love with research as an undergrad and knowing that though I didn't want to be a researcher for my entire life. So thinking, wanting to run research and development at a company. So for me personally, always industry was the goal. Academia, I love the freedom, but the grant life was just never for me. And so, kind of as I completed my PhD, I, was still looking at going into industry, being a scientist. However, kind of at the point that Gavin and Renee and Sonia are all at, finishing up that last kind of 6 months. Mine was accelerated because it was supposed to be about another year of work, but my PI got an offer to move her lab to Houston. And so that made it basically finishing up in 4 to 6 months. And I made the potentially wrong decision to try to finish up all the experiments that I was going to do in that year within that 4 months and then write my dissertation. And so, that definitely played a role in no longer wanting to be a scientist at that time, wanting to start branching out and looking at other opportunities within industry. So I did end up following my PI and doing a short postdoc in Houston to help her set up the lab. And it gave me that flexibility to look at other positions, along with her research that she was continuing was basically built off of the work that I did as a PhD of looking at injecting chemotherapies and nanoparticles directly into the cerebrospinal fluid as an alternative delivery route, and working directly with neurosurgeons on IND-enabling studies and some additional phase 1 clinical trials as well. And so, kind of at that point is when I started to see the MSL role. Initially just networking, understanding, the role a little bit better, really solidified in though that was what I wanted to do. And at that time then, really started to network and, pursue that MSL role. My own journey from, kind of identifying the MSL role and really landing my first role at Teva was about 11 months. You'll hear across the industry about 2 to 6 months is the shortest I've ever heard. And that's usually some kind of extenuating circumstances of they weren't really looking for it and kind of happened to get into it. But otherwise, 1 to 2 years is not uncommon for your first opportunity of breaking into an MSL role. So as mentioned, started with Teva on their neuropsychiatry and movement disorders team, supporting Austedo, indicated for HD chorea and tardive dyskinesia, which is a movement disorder from antipsychotic use. From there, I was promoted into a senior MSL before transitioning to Ionis, my current company, as a field medical director. And I was talking with Gavin a little bit before the call. So as a field medical director at Ionis, we are still very much MSLs in that I cover a territory of 7 states. And first and foremost is developing relationships with HCPs However, Ionis is kind of building out their first medical affairs. And so, the field medical director title reflects that we are a lot more involved internally as well, simply because we don't have all those positions filled. We're really developing those processes and procedures as we go. Kind of building that plane as we're trying to fly is how we often talk about it. And there I'm supporting their ASO or antisense oligonucleotide, specifically kind of a combination of neuro and cardiology. So not two that you probably would think of often. However, one of our disease states kind of crosses between the two just due to its systemic nature.
Okay, great. Yeah, very interesting background and covering a lot of areas. And then I did just forget to mention at the beginning, if anyone has any questions throughout the discussion, just feel free to enter them in the chat and we'll incorporate them into the discussion as we go. So I guess just another question leading on from that was, what was it that kind of drew you to the MSL role, and how did you identify this as the career path for you?
Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned, originally the plan was really to go into research and development, but due to kind of all those timings and things, just didn't feel like moving into a scientist position, and that's when I really started to expand my search into other areas within industry. And funny enough, one of the things that I used to joke with my PI, even going into industry, always talking about going into industry, was if I could be paid to talk about science all day, that would be perfect for me. And at the surface level, that is really what the MSL role allows us to do. And so that was kind of the initial switch or reason that I started to get drawn into the MSL role. That being said, it's only one portion of it. Yes, to be able to talk and communicate is highly important within that MSL role. But also too, you get into now that relationship building. I'm a little bit more of an extroverted scientist, although still, have a fair amount of introvert in me. And so, kind of as I put together some of those pieces and really those initial conversations with MSLs, my initial approach was just to try to talk to some, understand the role a little bit better, what drew them into the role. And the more I had those conversations, the more I learned about the role, and really, kind of the enjoyment that I got, and that I left every single one of my networking calls feeling energized and more motivated. Really, to me, kind of signaled that, again, building these relationships, having these conversations really did fit me and left me energized. And so being able to do so around science, really felt like the right position for me. And there's aspects that I like and don't like about the MSL role. I think everybody has them. But at the end of the day, it has been a great fit and a lot of fun to do.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And yeah, just to mention learning about the MSL role, it was Renee, who we have in the audience here, and Lindsay were the ones who started this. And I know me and Sonia and some of the other attendees today found this a great resource in learning more about the role and connecting with people in the industry. So hopefully we just continue to provide that value to people who are with us today as well. So then, just in relation to preparing for the MSL role, so what advice would you give to current graduate students that they could do to train or prepare for becoming an MSL?
Yeah, so everybody's going to be a little bit different in terms of how to exactly prepare, simply from the standpoint because everybody's projects as a PhD or PharmD are a little bit different. And so, one of the first things that I would recommend is, if you've already decided the MSL role is the right role for you, is really take a hard look at, what your PhD is, what sort of skills have you learned within that PhD, and, think about what gaps there are within your resume that you need to fill, and whether or not you can fill those as a PhD, or whether that might mean doing, looking for some internships, looking for opportunities to, do preceptorships or simply shadow somebody. Or potentially it does involve doing a postdoc in order to fill that gap. One of the biggest gaps that most people have is really that clinical side, especially for PhDs. Many of us are rooted in the basic science, which is, vastly important, is amazing work. But at the end of the day, for MSLs, we're really in the clinical data, in the clinical science. We still draw upon the basic science for some conversations, but at the end of the day, most physicians, their real goal is to understand what's the data in the patient populations, what is that patient population, and what is it that they should expect or be on the lookout for when using your medication. You'll get some that do want to go really deep into that basic science and every mechanism of action, every protein interaction that's going on, all of those different things, but that's relatively few and far between. And so from that standpoint, I think really looking at where your gaps are, look across job descriptions, you're going to see the same common theme. So, do you have communication? So have you been doing presentations? Have you been discussing your work and having those conversations, whether it's at conferences, whether that's even journal clubs, institution presentations, but really, do you have that scientific communication? Then beyond that, have you looked for opportunities to network and build relationships? If you're just working within your own lab all the time, try to find those opportunities to work with other labs, or even projects that span across different people within your lab. Or maybe it's taking on undergrads as like mentees within your lab, but finding those opportunities to really, lead a project as more than just, this is my project and I'm driving everything, to, leading a team or working, say, across different people and having to keep in mind, what their priorities are versus what your priorities are in any given project. As an MSL, you're going to be working, largely individually within your territory, but you're still going to be working a ton with your own team. How can we develop these resources? How can we build this narrative? How can we help each other succeed? And you're also going to be working cross-functionally. How can you support clinical development? How can you support health and economic research? How can you support your commercial colleagues? And so any way that you can show, that teamwork and ability to work across different functions, across different priorities is going to be huge. As a PhD, PharmD, the expectation is you're going to be able to learn the science, but obviously tangential experience is always going to be beneficial for you within that those first kind of roles. And then the other thing that I'll, kind of address in terms of figuring out whether or not the MSL role is really right for you is, first and foremost, be honest. A lot of people that I've talked to, they're drawn in by the flexibility of the work. They're drawn in by the pay that MSLs get. But at the end of the day, in our conversation with them, they're not probing. They don't feel engaged within that conversation, and it's the sad truth of, it's not the right fit for everybody. Not everybody is, and it's not to say you can't be introverted and be successful within this role, but you're probably going to have to adapt a little bit and step out of your comfort zone. And so are you really willing to do that? Are you willing to put yourself out there? Are you willing to deal with, 50, 60 rejected emails every single week? All of those different things. So, I think first and foremost is, as you have those conversations, really be honest with yourself in terms of, does this feel like a good fit for, what I like to do and who I am?
Yeah,
Great information.
Yeah, I just had a follow-up question to add on to the question you already asked. Kyle, if you don't mind sharing maybe one personal perceived gap that as you were looking over your own kind of CV and starting that job application process, of what you perceived as kind of the one thing you wanted to close the gaps on and elevate essentially before you started that whole interview process. If you don't mind sharing what that looked like and how did that come up in when you spoke to recruiters, the actual MSL team that was hiring you and others that you eventually started working with?
Yeah, so, in some ways, the clinical was still a piece that was a gap for me, although I did, some of those IND-enabling work, got a little bit of experience because we were launching it just as I ended up leaving. for the phase 1 clinical trial. That sort of thing, still a gap. So I definitely had to overcome that. And even related more so is, my background largely was in brain tumors, which is not a field where there is a lot of medications. You pretty much have 2 to 3 medications that are used within the brain tumor field, and that's simply it. And so trying to translate brain tumors as well, since they're such a unique beast, with delivery of the drugs being one of the biggest challenges versus understanding the biology. They're very different compared to a lot of tumor types. And so I really had to work on showcasing how my understanding of brain tumors and drug delivery can be relevant to other tumor types, and really highlighting some of those side projects in order to show the full encompassment of my knowledge within the neurology space, which is where I ended up actually breaking in, especially since oncology is such a challenging one. The other, kind of initially, and I filled it by doing work with Enrich or Adventure there in Houston, that kind of do consulting work for local Houston startups, was just my inexperience with industry and what it took to progress a product from, a concept phase to actually in the clinic. And so through that work was then able to get more experience of, putting together a competitive intelligence in terms of what is the market, how are you actually going to position your product within that market? Is there a large enough patient population or gap that you are filling to really make the work that you're doing impactful? So I definitely found ways to fill some of those gaps. As far as within my conversations, interviews, I'm not sure any specific ones really come to mind. We can talk about working with recruiters. At the end of the day, I really didn't end up working with many recruiters to land my first position, simply because, it is tough. They're working for the company, and not many companies are actively showing or advertising that they're looking for an MSL with no experience. And so it really becomes on to you to show that you're not going to put that company in jeopardy, which largely comes down to, are you going to get them in trouble? Do you understand the MSL role, proactive, reactive conversations, working with sales, that you're not going to say, get the company in trouble, is one of the biggest things that is a barrier to a new MSL.
Okay, great. And then, just in response to one of your previous answers, somebody was asking, I think in regards to the skills. So would you not worry about applying to an MSL role that preferred a particular science background, for example, rare diseases, if your PhD focused on another disease type or condition?
So at the end of the day, no, I would not worry about that. I will say, at the end of the day, you're trying to reduce as many barriers as you can. So you already don't have MSL experience. That's going to be your highest barrier. And now if you're trying to overcome the barrier of, I have no knowledge. So, for my background in oncology, neurology as being kind of the broadest ones, me trying to apply to MSL positions for cardiology at that time probably was not going to happen. I had no background in cardiology. There was just nothing that I could provide to say, yes, I can learn this new space outside of being a PhD and being able to learn, to give them that understanding that, okay, they're going to try to be learning how to become an MSL while also trying to learn an entirely new, not any knowledge base. And so from that standpoint, I tend to recommend to people, at least looking for that tangential experience. So again, brain tumors, neurology. So I had to think about, how are all these brain areas? What's the blood flow to all these brain areas? How's the vasculature impacting these different areas? Did have those side projects in TBI, ALS, work in neurodegeneration. And so, highlighting each of those into how does that all encompass into some knowledge that I can learn and adapt my knowledge within that neuro space. But no, at the end of the day, wouldn't let it stop you if your experience is not perfectly in line with whatever disease state it is they're looking for.
I just seen here, Kelly. Kelly, you raised your hand. Do you have a question you'd like to ask?
I do, thanks. So my name's Kelly Blake. I'm actually an optometrist looking to get into the MSL space. I am curious because you mentioned kind of as an aside, kind of connection with sales. And as I've been looking into this role, I feel like the sources that I've seen, I feel like there kind of runs this gamut of, I see places that say there should be no interaction between sales and MSLs. I see things like, oh, MSLs help train the sales force. I see things like in terms of addressing off-label questions that you should never say anything off-label versus like, well, it's okay if you have an unsolicited request for that information. So I'm kind of curious, just in your experience, does it run the gamut, and is it kind of different from company to company? And do you think that that is a fair question to ask during the interview? Kind of like, oh, how does this organization like address that or navigate that? Because again, my fear in asking is, like you just mentioned, I don't want to give them the perception that I'm going to get them into trouble, that I don't know anything. So a lot of multi-part questions. I'll stop talking and see what you can give me for some advice.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, it's going to change from company to company. And I think that's going to be your in terms of, I don't know if I would bring it up proactively within an interview of how does your MSLs work with sales? But if you get that question in terms of, how would you expect to work with your commercial colleagues, I think it's perfectly appropriate to then say, well, I know every company is a little bit different. Here are some ways that I've heard that MSLs can work with sales. And then, put that question to them of, how do you guys expect your MSLs to work with sales? Or how do you, what kind of firewalls do you guys have? And, a lot of that comes down to each individual company's risk tolerance. We're all working off the same guidelines. However, they are guidelines for many of these things. And so that is open, just like any law, to interpretation. And so every company has their own compliance department that is going to interpret these guidelines in ever so slightly different ways. And some also, they interpret them the same way, but they just go, we don't want to worry about it. It's a hard line. You're not talking to them. That hasn't been my experience so far. So I've had relationships with my commercial colleagues. You do have to be careful, what those conversations are and how you're working with them. For me, that relationship is kind of around a couple of different places. First is understanding the territory. So when I started at Teva, and so I guess for context, at Ionis, we don't have a commercial division yet. So I'm not working with any commercial colleagues yet at Ionis. But so at Teva, I had those conversations with my commercial colleagues, mainly from the standpoint of most of my sales reps had been in those territories for 10, 15, 20 years. I'm coming into this territory with very little experience. So just understanding, from their perspective, what are the big institutions, the big players, with the caveat that I always said to them of, at the end of the day, I'm going to set my meetings. I'm going to decide who it is that I want to meet with, but I'm going to take, your valuable knowledge of this territory. Or maybe that, there's a new up and comer that's working with somebody that might not be on my radar. Or, sometimes my sales rep would be able to tell me, yeah, if you're going to reach out to this doctor, you actually want to reach out to their assistant, that's here, because they're the gatekeeper, or the clinic manager is the gatekeeper for their entire schedule. And so, just kind of some of those tidbits are extremely helpful in terms of developing your territory and understanding your territory. That said, no, I'm not going to be talking to my sales rep about what conversations I'm having or even really who I'm meeting with, unless it somehow directly impacts them. So, sometimes if I was going into their territory and knew that they met with them quite often, I might give them a heads up, hey, I'm going to be in your territory meeting with so-and-so, just so that, we don't end up having back-to-back meetings. And then the office is confused of why did we have two different people from the same company in back-to-back meetings? And then, let's see, your other part of your question of, oh, it just left, hold on.
I think you hit everything. Just basically like, is that true? There seems to be a gray area. And would you ask in an interview, are you going to look like you don't know what you're talking about? So thank you.
I think the one last was the off-label questions. And so there, I'm never talking about anything off-label. For the most part, I'm not talking anything science outside of what's in the package insert with my sales rep. So if they have a question around the package insert, I can answer that question. And we did do training for them, but that is a very set deck on what we're training them on. We don't go beyond that. And yeah, I can have a off-label discussion with an HCP. However, I'm never bringing that up proactively. The sales rep can't reach out to me and say, hey, they had this question, or I really think you should reach out to them because they're wanting to use it for this. That's not compliant. I can't do that. And I'm going to tell them exactly that. But if the doctor had that question, they submit a MER, a medical information request, they can check the box to have me follow up with them. And I can have that conversation with the doctor because the doctor made that unsolicited question to the sales rep. Or if they make the unsolicited question to me, I can have that conversation.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. And then, yeah, you previously mentioned just about talking to people who are in the MSL role when you were interested in it. So we do just have a question as well from someone about the importance of networking, and then maybe some tips that you could give on like maybe some good practices for when you are trying to network with people in the MSL role.
Yeah, I mean, in my own experience and from most people I talk to, networking is really king in terms of getting into your first MSL role. Just applying through job postings, whether it's on LinkedIn or the company website, whatever that case may be, just applying there, it was typically crickets. Every once in a while, you got a rejection email, sometimes 30 seconds after you submitted, sometimes 3 months after you submitted, but most of the time you just never heard anything from that submission. And the case is when you just submit through that job posting, most of the time it's going through an automatic tracking system. And even if at the end of the day the hiring manager is open to somebody with no MSL experience, that's not what the automatic tracking system is looking for. They're looking for what that job description says of 1 to 2 years or 2 to 3 years of MSL experience. They're looking for those keywords. And, as somebody without an MSL experience, you can't have MSL and those keywords in there enough to overcome that. If you do, I would be curious to what that actual resume says, and if it actually provides any information about you. So networking, absolutely. By getting that referral, if you can get a referral from somebody at the company, usually that allows you to bypass that automatic tracking system, at least somebody human looking at your resume and giving it a chance. From there, it's still up to you to make that impression and convince them to give yourself a chance. In terms of my own approach to networking or, advice as far as what to do, my own approach to begin with, reaching out to anybody that was an MSL, asking them for their time was not a directed approach, just trying to understand, again, whether or not the MSL role was actually the right fit for me. But from there, really looking at, okay, I feel good about the MSL role. What companies fit my areas of expertise, whether or not they have job postings at this time, but really looking at what companies say have even those divisions, or have potentially products in their pipeline that are in phase 3 that are coming up soon. And then being targeted of trying to reach out to MSLs on those teams at those companies so that I can have a more direct conversation. I can also reach out to them as to, beyond just trying to learn about the MSL role. No, I also want to learn about this company. I'm really excited about these products that are coming up your pipeline. Being able to personalize that message and, give them a reason as to why to talk to me as well. For the most part, if somebody I connect with most people if they reach out to me for a connection request. But if then their first message to me is just simply, hey, I'm interested in the MSL role, would you be willing to give me some time to discuss about it? I'm probably not going to respond to them. I, get on average probably 6 to 10 requests and messages each week. And so I'm going to prioritize those that gave me a reason to talk with them, that showed that I wasn't just another email that they blasted out that day, that they actually gave some thought into why they're trying to connect with me or have a discussion with me. And from that targeted approach as well, that provides you the opportunity to follow up. So again, even if they don't have a position open right now, you don't know when that's going to change, whether somebody leaving, whether they decide to expand their team, whatever the case may be. And so if you can be already connected with somebody at that company on that team that you can then follow up with when that job posting comes out, now again, you've already established a relationship. If they give you that time again to discuss that role, good indication that you can ask for that referral at the end of that conversation. So anytime, again, you can make it more personal. You can show that you've done your research into the company and why you're actually interested in this role. It is going to help you. And anytime you can be following up with somebody a second time or a third time when that job posting comes up, your better chances of actually getting a referral from that person compared to, hey, I saw this job posting, would you refer me?
Okay, yeah, some great advice on networking there. And then that also answered some of the other questions we had in relation to actually searching for jobs. And maybe even if you are networking, you might even be able to hear about them before they're posted or about to be. And then we have Sarah here would like to ask a question. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself, Sarah.
Hey, thank you so much for organizing this and for being here to talk with us. I'm a postdoc right now in immunology, and I'm looking to break into my first MSL role. And I was wondering, one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is how to really market some of those, quote unquote, soft skills that are really important as an MSL. You can't have experience that you don't have, but you can, talk about I guess your networking skills and your social engineering skills as like functional instead of descriptive. And I was wondering how you kind of approached, showing off that you have those outside of, or like when you're submitting applications.
Yeah, so going back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, as far as gaps in your resume or filling some of those gaps, in terms of looking for opportunities to work cross-functionally, to develop projects that collaborate with others, whatever that case may be. But I guess my approach to it was looking for specific projects or specific presentations, specific grants, whatever that case may be, still something tangible or with an outcome to it that can also be highlighting in terms of, this project resulted in a publication, but the part of the project that I was highlighting was this project worked across 3 different teams, and I was the one leading that project. And so that required, that right there is showing I was able to work across multiple different teams, keep things on track, keep things on time, with the ultimate outcome of we had a publication, a presentation, a grant, whatever that outcome was, but using that outcome to highlight what I did or contributed within that project to highlight that soft skill. And so, as a postdoc, I would imagine that you are overseeing some lab techs, or at least have lab techs working on projects with you, or undergrads, or even grad students working on projects with you. And so leading those types of teams is huge in terms of showing your ability to work with others and your ability to maintain those timelines, maintain that communication, and really keep that everything organized in order to progress those projects forward.
Okay, great. And then just have another question from the audience. Just asking well, another question here from Sarah as well. So I'll ask the one that was put in the chat first. About a PhD student working towards pancreatic cancer therapy. And then they said they've been networking, but another barrier they're facing is just with international students and visa issues. And if you've just ever come across anything related to that.
Unfortunately, that's not an area that I have much expertise in. You know, I know people that still land MSL roles. It can, unfortunately, you know, as sad as it is, be a barrier, just in terms of when they are evaluating different candidates of, you know, one having to sponsor a visa versus one that they don't. But I don't have enough experience in that area to truly comment on.
Okay.
Hi, I have a follow-up question to that. I asked the question. So yeah, I have been hearing the same response, but like, I also want to know that if you have suggestions for different field of jobs, like or different positions that we can try so as to make sure that we land into MSL eventually.
So what other positions to potentially look at before the MSL role? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, because since it's difficult to get sponsored, I was wondering if there are other positions that I can have the experience, and then eventually that would boost up my resume to kind of compete with getting sponsored for MSL.
Yeah, that's actually in line with a question I was going to ask as well. Just a little bit more general, just kind of being, we know how hard it can be to break into the MSL role. So maybe if you do a postdoc or maybe some other career paths that you could go into as well is very much in line with that question that would improve your candidacy for becoming an MSL.
Yeah, so the three most common that you probably have heard discussed and that I hear discussed is going to be, I guess, a little bit more from the lack of clinical side, is like a clinical research coordinator. It's often a great way to get that clinical experience, clinical trial experience. You're also networking with HCPs. You'll probably also interact with MSLs, you know, especially if it's, you know, at a large academic institution that is running a lot of these clinical trials, or is, you know, something like an MD Anderson or something like that. You're going to be exposed to MSLs, to industry, to HCPs, and clinical trials. Looking more so within industry, the two most common that are discussed is either looking at medical writing, and not to say just any medical writing. I would try to be strategic, or try to find something where you're going to get exposure, even if it's not everything, but at least exposure to, you know, working with companies on medical writing, whether that's publications of their own clinical trial data. So, you know, writing up clinical trial papers. You know, sometimes companies also use medical writers to write their package inserts and assist with some of those. And so, you know, having a way to get exposure, again, usually to that clinical side, to the industry through medical writing can often be a good way to get some of that more exposure and fill some of those gaps. And then the last is kind of related, but within the medical information. So again, medical information is going to be involved in the standard response letters that HCPs get whenever they have those medical information requests. You know, the MSL might do additional follow-up, but medical information is putting together that initial response. Here's what that full data is, and is, you know, interacting with HCPs in terms of how do we disseminate this data. Kind of related to both, I guess, could be also scientific communications. So again, you're going to be involved in publication writing. You're going to be involved in poster presentations and putting those together and figuring out what's the cadence in terms of how are we putting out these different data or posters, publications to best support that actual end product. You know, kind of different potentially from academia. It's not just publish as soon as you can. You know, there's strategy that goes into that of, okay, we have these conferences coming up. Here's when the product's going to launch, or here's when the next change and coverage is going to happen, and when are we putting that data out so that there's a nice cadence and people are being exposed to that data kind of in a more appropriate time frame versus just dumping it all out at once. So I think all of those, depending on where your gap is or what sort of experience you're looking for, can all provide very valuable experiences towards the MSL role.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. And then Sarah, I see you have your hand raised. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask.
Great, thank you. So I'm very excited. I have a phone interview coming up for an MSL position. Upon looking at who the phone interview is with, it's someone who doesn't look like they have a lot of experience in the therapeutic area side of things. She's a recruiter, and it's only 30 minutes. I've heard that as part of the MSL recruiting process, there's usually a pretty extensive presentation. And so I was wondering if you could shed some light on, I guess, what this first sort of gatekeeper interview is, and then if there's any sort of standardization in terms of how many rounds of interviews and how the pressure is amped up for each one.
Yeah, so congratulations, first and foremost, best of luck. Every company is going to be a little bit different in terms of what's in each individual interview and how many interviews you have. So I think my first role ended up having 4/5. And my current role, I had 6 interviews. So it really, it varies. For the most part, you're probably going to have somewhere around 4 or more. My experience, that first interview, as you said, is kind of a gatekeeper interview. Not to say that it's not important, but it's really just kind of that first check of, okay, at least on paper, this person looks like someone that we potentially want to talk to. And it's a little bit more, usually is with a recruiter or HR rep. And it's really just to kind of understand, okay, at the base level, why are you interested in our company? What do you understand about the role in the company? And just kind of get a sense in terms of what your personality is and whether or not you potentially could be a good fit from like an overall company culture perspective. Since it is, say, oftentimes in HR, they're looking at that full company culture. So they're not going to usually dig into any of the science there. They're not going to really dig into your expertise in a specific therapeutic area. I say it's often a little bit more just getting to know you and your personality and whether or not it seems like you would be a good fit. Why are you interested in this company? And making sure that you are still interested in this company. Sometimes you might get one of those and you've already, at this point now signed with another one. And so you are no longer interested. Moving on from that, again, the exact order when you give a presentation, how many presentations, varies from company to company. So one, I had to give 2 presentations, the other only 1 presentation. Typically, if you end up doing 2 and like one is on a scientific topic of your choice, and the other is basically, on some paper or clinical trial for the product that you'll be supporting. That first one is really looking at, before we have you go into our data and all that stuff, with something that you're comfortable with, can you give an effective presentation? So, very simple of what's your presence up there? How can you distill a scientific information? And can you put together a nice flowing presentation? Do you come up with 20 slides for a 10-minute presentation? Probably not going to be a good fit, probably not going to move you on to other interviews. And then as you move in, how quickly can you upskill into a new therapeutic area? And again, still looking at your ability to present, to distill that scientific information to a company. And, especially if you're getting into the clinical trial data, now looking for some of those, base skills of an MSL. So as an MSL, our job is not to sell. Our job is not to provide our own commentary. Our job is to discuss what the data is. And that is pretty much it. I'm not saying that, it's a pretty safe drug or it's a safe drug. No, here's what the adverse events were. Here's what the safety profile was. I can say the authors concluded it was well tolerated. but it's not me saying it's a well-tolerated drug, because that's my opinion. It's at the end of the day, though, what I'm presenting is what the data is, and allowing that HCP and understanding, what does the HCP think? Do they think it's a safe drug, or is there some side effect that comes up that to them is a huge concern? And then related to that, if you're giving us, any sort of product presentation, if you show efficacy, you must show safety. And again, making sure that you're not providing your own conclusions, that these are the author's conclusions.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, yeah. And leading on from that, let's say now you've gone through the interview process and you're after becoming an MSL. So what were some of the challenges that you faced when you became an MSL first, and then maybe just more generally that commonly seen with MSL, some of the challenges of the role?
Yeah, so I think it's unique for everybody to some extent. As I say, everybody's going to excel in different portions or areas of the MSL role that necessarily doesn't fit them as well. I think one thing that I underestimated, and it is definitely a challenge no matter when, but especially starting off, is how much time you're going to spend on just managerial and sending emails. You spend a significant amount of your time reaching out to HCPs just to schedule those meetings, and especially starting off, hopefully your territory was previously filled, and these HCPs have a relationship with your company, but you're still somebody new reaching out to them, or potentially it's a new team, or hasn't had somebody in that territory for a while, and you're really restarting from fresh. And so you're really going to take some time. You're going to send a lot of emails. As I say, send out 50, ecstatic if you get 5 to 10 responses from those 50 emails. Starting off, because you're reaching out cold to people. Some other challenges that really come up, I think one of the biggest mistakes that new MSLs make, you go through a period of 1 to 3 months of training. You've been spending all of your time looking at all of this data that you have around your product. You get into those first couple meetings and you just end up blurting every single thing out. You don't really take the time to allow the HCP to respond. You don't kind of project that data or phrase that data responses in a way that leaves it open for them to respond, or to really draw out their opinions on the data. So I think data dumping is one of the biggest things that I see people make, and myself included. My first couple meetings, I got out of those, and as I was talking with my mentor and kind of talking through with my boss, of just like, I didn't really leave any openings for additional meetings. Like, there wasn't leftover things to discuss. Just you covered everything at too high of a surface level, which then makes it hard for you to reach out and have another discussion. So my approach now in those first meetings is, my goal is just to get to know you, to get to know that physician, understand where their interests are, what patient populations they're seeing, and really, just understand and try to start to identify, how can I potentially provide value to this person? What sort of things should I reach out to them for? What sort of things they're probably not going to be interested in? And it's always evolving, but really taking that approach of, my job isn't to show you how much I know. My job is to find out what it is that you think and where the gaps are that I can provide value to you.
Okay, and then so in your role as an MSL, and just in progressing your career in medical affairs, what kind of skills or attributes are particularly relevant to just help you become a better MSL? And maybe if people want to progress to higher levels within medical affairs, just some advice there.
Yeah, so it's still going to be the same skills and just refining those skills. So your ability to communicate the science, your ability to develop relationships. So a lot is going to be around your emotional intelligence. Can you keep your head about you if somebody is pushing back on your data? Can you read, if you're presenting a poster to a physician, can you pick up on the smaller cues in terms of, okay, here's a place where they potentially are interested and I should dig a little bit deeper into this data. Or, they checked their watch twice in the last 2 minutes. I should probably wrap this up and, move on to something else. And so, I think a lot of it is refinement, and a lot is just having those meetings. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to find better ways of doing things. You're going to get, I think a lot is around business acumen and understanding, there's lots of interesting things that HCPs say that can help you in other conversations, that can help just your own understanding of the disease state, but they might not be true insights in terms of impacting the company. And so, kind of narrowing in that, and that's going to help you in your questioning as well, of understanding what are the business needs, how can I impact strategy, what are our needs right now in terms of that strategy, both executing and, potential gaps for future, which I think at the end of the day just takes time. In terms of kind of progressing throughout your career, I think first and foremost is being accepting of, no, I'm not going to be the expert in every single meeting. I'm not going to be the expert on my team. So really relying on your team and providing your expertise where you can, but also relying on, somebody else has more expertise within a specific therapeutic area, or around a specific question of leaning on those people, and, not being afraid to admit when you don't know, whether that's in an HCP meeting or in a meeting with your colleagues, and really, say relying on everybody else and working together. Additional just kind of growth for me, and this is where kind of coming back to raising your hand and taking on responsibilities, especially early on, you're not going to know exactly what aspects of medical affairs, the MSL role, career progression, what is the right fit for you or is of interest to you. So my own approach was raise my hand, take on opportunities, help out the team, help out myself, get exposure to different people, different functions, and really start to narrow that down and understand. So, now when I raise my hand for additional projects, I'm a little bit more strategic in those, and which ones either help, utilize a skill that I really love to use, or help develop a new skill that is related to where I want to end up. That's not to say at the end of the day, projects are going to come up that just need to be done. We need some help on. It helps out your team, helps everybody, function better, and you still take those on. But being willing to say no, and when you simply don't have the bandwidth and somebody else can do so, and being a little bit more strategic in what you're raising your hand for. But, I don't think the MSL role or moving up within pharma is different from anywhere else. Showing your ability to deliver on what you say you're going to deliver on, continuing to expand your skill sets, and, showing that you are a team player and that you're not just there for yourself, you're there for the company and you're there for your team.
Okay, and then in your experience and going from an MSL to senior MSL, and then now as a field medical director, and how have your responsibilities kind of evolved or added over time in those roles?
Yeah, so, I'd say the biggest way that the responsibilities have changed, or, my own contributions have changed, is kind of goes back to that business acumen and really understanding where you can provide value. So, you start off as an MSL, you're trying to get your feet wet, you're trying to figure out what the heck you're doing. But as you keep progressing of, say identifying where it is that your strengths are, where can you really contribute and excel within your team? How can that fit in the broader team? But then, at the same time, because as you move up into those different positions, into a senior MSL, into a field medical director, into a medical director, the expectation is you're going to be able to make those decisions. You're going to have, the ability to communicate cross-functionally. You're not going to need to rely on your boss in order to, figure out what to do. You're going to come up with your own ideas in terms of, okay, here's a gap either in our data, in our processes, really showing that you're going beyond just your core role. And so, the core MSL role is building those relationships. As you move up, you become a lot more internal facing, and really understanding what's the impact of these interactions, of these different data requests, of these educational gaps across a lot of HCPs, not just your single HCP that you're dealing with, and how any of those activities can support the company, support the brand, and support getting your product into the right patients in order to grow that field.
Okay, great. And then just two quick kind of general questions that we had that were submitted prior by some people in the audience. Was one just about certifications and MSL certifications, if they're beneficial in landing a role as an MSL. And then also just someone is asking about MSL opportunities for nurse practitioners, if there are as well.
Yeah. So I think the nurse practitioner one's an easy one. Yes, absolutely. Not every company will be looking for nurse practitioners. But at the end of the day, I would say I would expect that their portion of MSLs is going to drastically increase over these next couple of years. And part of that is driven by the fact that also on the treating side, PAs and nurse practitioners are spending more and more time with patients, and they're providing a lot of that general care to a lot of patients. And so from that perspective, their knowledge and ability to connect with those HCPs is extremely valuable to companies. And so there's a lot that are expanding to include a lot more PAs and NPs. Some of it's, I think, a little bit therapeutic area specific, just in terms of, again, is it relevant in terms of, are a lot of nurse practitioners and PAs seeing this patient population? In which case, that's beneficial, again, as the peer-to-peer side of having a nurse practitioner as an MSL that is interfacing with a lot of nurse practitioners and physician assistants. And then, what was the other side of the question? Sorry.
I'm so sorry for asking you two at the same time.
No, you're good.
The other question was just one that gets commonly asked in regard to MSL certifications. If they can improve your chances of becoming an MSL.
Yeah, so I'm personally of the camp of, the certifications are not necessary. I don't think at this time they are vetted enough or accepted enough as being, the gold standard by any means. Potentially that will change as more people go through it, as they continue to refine. But at this time, I haven't seen a drastic shift from somebody that has a certification versus somebody that does not, in terms of their ability to break into their first role, or even as an MSL. Now, that said, I think it goes back to, again, what's your gaps and whether or not doing that certification fills a gap and helps you personally become a better candidate. Taking out, having any letters at the end of your name, like any certification letters, taking that part out of it, but just simply the knowledge that you're going to gain in that, will that help you gain a better understanding of the MSL role and be a better MSL? And so from that perspective, I think they can be, extremely valuable. I didn't do a full certification, but I did the From Science to Pharma, their kind of like program that they have, which really just kind of covers the basics of the MSL role, of the clinical trial landscape, what happens in different phases, how the MSL is involved in different phases. So, really kind of high level in a lot of cases, but it was able to just help me put all of the different conversations I was having into a little bit different perspective, or a better perspective, really integrate them into my knowledge, and also just be exposed to industry language and acronyms and lingo, and understanding what those different things means, which again is going to be beneficial of showing that you have that understanding and you can speak the language of industry in the MSL role. So at the end of the day, I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but I think they can be beneficial just from your own perspective of advancing your skills.
Okay, great advice. And then just to be mindful of time, we're just over the hour now. So the last question that we like to ask each of our speakers is, what is one thing you wish you had known or done differently before becoming an MSL?
In terms of trying to break into the MSL role, I think the first thing that I wish I knew was the fact that if you apply to a position, that after that point, you're considered a known candidate for oftentimes 1 to 2 years for that company. And so if you just apply to every single job posting that's out there, you can actually end up hurting yourself, because now they consider you a known candidate. You apply to another position, maybe a different therapeutic area, but they feel that you've already been in their system, they've already looked at you, and you're more likely than not going to be straight away rejected. It also impacts your ability to work with a recruiter for that position in the future until whatever time frame that company specifies. So until you're no longer considered a known candidate, a recruiter cannot help you get a position at that company. Now, hopefully you're not leaving your first MSL role within 1 or 2 years, but many do, and that may be the case. And so it could impact you in looking for that next role, in terms of working with a recruiter or just even applying to those positions.
Okay, yeah, absolutely fantastic advice there and a great discussion overall. So yeah, I'd just like to take a moment to thank everyone who was in attendance today, and then also thank Dr. Kyle Householder, who's been very gracious with his time, and he's been great to people in medical affairs, in the community, and those looking to become MSLs, as he's been on, I think we've always mentioned it on this webinar, but Tom Caravella's podcast a few times, and he's been on some of the live events done by Tom as well, and now this one with us with Ask and Tell with MSL. So yeah, Kyle's been fantastic at paying it forward to the community and helping others as well. And then just also like to mention, if anyone would like, they can go follow us on LinkedIn if they aren't already, and they can reach out to me and Sonia as well on LinkedIn. And also, I'm sure Kyle will be okay if people would like to reach out to him as well, if they send him a nice message as well to go along with it, and help work in your networking skills too a little bit. And then we're also just like take the opportunity to say, if anyone does have any suggestions for future guest speakers that they could recommend or topics that they would like to hear, then feel free to get in touch with us as well regarding those. And that's everything that I've got. So do you have anything that you'd like to add, Sonia?
No, I just wanted to put it out there that you feel free to connect with me and Gavin as well on LinkedIn. We post regularly about this group, and you can get the live notifications for next month's webinar.
Yep, so stay tuned for that. And once we have the date and time finalized, we'll get that posted up as well for next month. And then yeah, that's everything that we got for today. I'd just like to thank everyone again, and Kyle for being our speaker. So
thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.